Dawn came reluctantly to Ashbourne Estate, as though even the sun hesitated to expose what the night had whispered into being. Pale light crept across clipped lawns and gravel drives, catching on the lacquered sides of carriages already queuing at the front approach. Horses stamped, wheels groaned. Below stairs, servants moved with unnatural quiet, their murmurs sharp and furtive as sparrows in hedges. In Regency England, reputations did not shatter with noise. They cracked softly, carried on breath, and spread by breakfast. This was a world governed by surfaces, by the sheen of silk, the weight of titles, the precise angle of a bow. Appearances were not merely social ornaments. They were law. A woman might survive poverty, illness, even loneliness. But to survive suspicion was another matter entirely. Miss Eleanor Harcourt had learned this early. At 22, she occupied a peculiar and perilous position within Ashbourne's grand walls. She was neither servant nor true relation, but a dependent cousin, presentable enough to dine above stairs, yet dispensable enough to be forgotten without explanation. Her mother had died young. Her father's modest clerical income had vanished with him. What remained of Eleanor's life had been folded neatly into the charity of wealthier kin. Gratitude was expected. Silence was required. That morning, Eleanor descended to breakfast with her usual careful composure, her pale blue gown pressed, her dark hair braided with deliberate restraint. She paused at the threshold of the dining room, sensing before she saw it the absence. The long table gleamed with silver and porcelain, yet the chair she customarily occupied remained unclaimed, subtly but unmistakably removed. No one looked at her. Her cousin, Miss Arabella Harcourt, laughed lightly at something said by one of the Duke's visiting acquaintances, her smile serene, her posture effortless in its confidence. Arabella's gaze flicked toward Eleanor for the briefest instant, cool, assessing, then slid away, as though Eleanor were no longer quite solid enough to warrant acknowledgement. "Ah," Eleanor murmured, too softly for anyone to hear, and withdrew. It was a small humiliation. That was how such things were done. Not with cruelty, but with omission. No raised voice, no accusation. Only the quiet rearrangement of the world until one no longer fit within it. Later that morning, as Eleanor passed through the east corridor, she caught fragments of conversation drifting from the morning room. Two ladies, guests of Ashbourne, impeccably gloved, lowered their voices as she approached. "Quite necessary, I'm told," one whispered. "Indeed, such arrangements must be made discreetly." They smiled politely as Eleanor passed, their eyes reflecting pity sharpened by relief. Relief that it was not they who stood on uncertain ground. The truth came to her not through confrontation, but accident, through the carelessness of others who believed her already gone. In the still room that afternoon, a housemaid fumbled with a tray, cheeks flushing as she noticed Eleanor standing nearby. "I beg your pardon, miss," the girl stammered, then hesitated. "I thought you were already informed." "Informed of what?" Eleanor asked gently. The maid swallowed. "Of your departure, miss. His Grace wished it arranged before the wedding announcement, so as not to cause inconvenience." The word struck harder than any insult. Wedding, departure, inconvenience. Eleanor thanked the girl and turned away before her expression could betray her. She walked the length of the corridor in perfect silence, each step measured, each breath a triumph of control. In her small bedchamber, she closed the door and leaned her forehead briefly against the cool wood. The Duke of Ashbourne was to marry her cousin, and Eleanor was to vanish quietly, like a footnote erased from the page. Night fell with unseasonable fury. Rain lashed the windows. Wind rattled the panes. The house settled into sleep, chandeliers dimmed, doors bolted, propriety restored. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the shadowed canopy above her bed, her heart pounding with an urgency that would not be reasoned with. To leave without protest would be safe. To speak would be ruinous. Yet something within her, some final remnant of dignity, refused to be dismissed like an unwanted object. She rose. Her nightgown was simple linen, unadorned, its modesty suitable only for solitude. She did not cloak herself. She did not bind her hair. She opened her door and stepped into the corridor barefoot, the cold of the stone sharpening her resolve. The Duke's private library glowed faintly at the far end of the west wing. Firelight flickered beneath the door. She knocked once. Inside, the Duke of Ashbourne, 34, broad-shouldered, newly returned from war and responsibility alike, looked up in startled disbelief as the door opened and Eleanor Harcourt stood before him, pale as the stormlight, hair unbound, eyes blazing with a courage born of desperation. "My lord," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "you will hear me." For a moment, he could not speak. The shock was not of impropriety alone, though that was considerable, but of presence. She was not the quiet girl he had overlooked for months. She was sudden, unyielding, painfully alive. "You should not be here," he said at last, rising slowly. "No," Eleanor replied, stepping fully into the room, the fire casting her shadow tall upon the shelves. "I should not, and yet I am." She did not plead. She did not flirt. She spoke of her life reduced to convenience, of decisions made without her consent, of dignity treated as expendable. Her hand shook. Her eyes did not. Ashbourne listened, anger flaring, then faltering. This was not the confrontation he had anticipated from anyone, least of all her. When she finished, silence claimed the room. Rain battered the windows. The fire cracked. "I did not intend harm," he said carefully. "No," Eleanor answered. "You intended indifference. That is far worse." She turned then, before he could respond, before regret or apology could undo her resolve. She left him standing amid leather-bound volumes and unanswerable thoughts. Before dawn, she returned to her chamber. Before dawn, the Duke of Ashbourne stood alone, unsettled, staring into the dying fire. The house slept, but the walls had heard, and society, though not yet aware, was already beginning to stir. The Duke of Ashbourne did not seek Eleanor Harcourt after that night. Outwardly, his conduct was impeccable. He resumed his role as host with faultless courtesy, presiding over dinners and morning calls as though no woman had ever stood barefoot before his fire, challenging his judgment with eyes bright as steel. His manner toward Eleanor, when circumstance demanded acknowledgment, was distant to the point of chill, polite, measured, entirely unremarkable. It was precisely this restraint that failed him. For Eleanor, the days that followed unfolded beneath a low, gathering pressure, like air before a storm. She expected dismissal at any hour. Each footstep in the corridor tightened her chest. Each summons from above stairs felt like a sentence deferred rather than commuted. Yet none came. Her trunk remained untouched. Her small allowance was not withdrawn. Her name lingered, improbably, on the household lists. Society noticed. At the next musicale hosted at Ashbourne, Eleanor sat at the far edge of the drawing room, hands folded, spine straight, prepared to disappear into the wallpaper of civility. Instead, she felt eyes upon her, glances that slid too slowly away, smiles that came a breath too late. Conversations hushed as she passed. Nothing overt, everything intentional. A young baroness leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Is that not the one?" The music swelled, mercifully loud, and Eleanor fixed her gaze on the polished floor, her cheeks burning with an emotion she could not name. It was not shame alone. It was anticipation, unwelcome, irrational, that something unseen was already in motion. She learned the truth of it on a cold afternoon, scarcely a week later. She had gone to the small morning room to retrieve a volume she had once borrowed from the library, an old history of Rome she favored for its merciless clarity. When she opened it, a folded slip of paper fell into her hand. Her name, written in a precise masculine script. No signature, no message, only the quiet return of something she loved, placed deliberately where only she would find it. Eleanor closed the book slowly. It was nothing. It was everything. From that moment, the air between them changed, subtly, irrevocably. Their exchanges, when they could not be avoided, took on a gravity that unsettled her more than hostility would have. In the corridor, he paused a fraction longer than necessary to allow her passage. At dinner, his gaze lifted instinctively when she spoke, then withdrew with careful discipline. Once, as she rose from a chair, a footman brushed past too closely, and before Eleanor could steady herself, a cloak appeared at her shoulders. Dark wool, unmistakably his. The Duke did not meet her eyes as he murmured, "You are chilled, Miss Harcourt." The room saw courtesy. Eleanor felt the ground tilt. Her cousin Arabella was not slow to notice. "You are remarkably favored," Arabella observed one morning, her tone light, her smile sharpened at the edges. "It is unusual, is it not, for one so peripherally connected to enjoy such consideration?" Eleanor answered with the calm she had learned as armor. "Consideration is not favor, cousin. It is merely good breeding." Arabella's gaze lingered. Something calculating flickered there before she turned away. Whispers followed. A matron of formidable reputation watched Eleanor with narrowed eyes during afternoon tea. A footman, newly arrived and insufficiently discreet, was overheard repeating that his grace had been much disturbed of late. A lady's maid remarked that Miss Harcourt's departure had been postponed again. Each fragment alone meant little. Together, they formed a pattern too dangerous to ignore. For the Duke, the struggle was no longer abstract. He had believed himself disciplined beyond temptation. War had taught him the cost of hesitation. Inheritance had taught him restraint. He had intended marriage as a matter of order, a union that would secure lineage and silence expectation. Eleanor Harcourt disrupted none of those plans by force. She did so by existing. He found himself watching her in moments she did not guard, when she listened rather than spoke, when she smiled without calculation, when her attention softened at the turn of a phrase or the lift of music. She was not bold in society. She was exacting in thought. And it was this unadorned intelligence, this refusal to bend, that eroded his resolve. The night of their confession came without design. Rain had returned, insistent as memory, driving guests indoors early from a garden gathering that had strained civility to its limits. Eleanor lingered under the colonnade, reluctant to re-enter rooms dense with judgment. When she turned, she found the Duke behind her, the last of the others already gone. "My lord," she said, stiffening. "Miss Harcourt." His voice was low, restrained with effort. "You should not remain here." "Nor should you," she replied quietly. They stood facing one another as rain darkened the stone between them. The world narrowed to breath and restraint. At last, he spoke, not as a duke, but as a man exhausted by pretense. "I did not intend for matters to proceed thus," he said. "I believe myself capable of detachment." Eleanor's chin lifted. "Detachment is a privilege afforded to those whose lives are not undone by its absence." The words hung between them, gentle, devastating. "I was wrong," he admitted. "About you. About myself." She did not smile. She did not retreat. "You were wrong to believe silence harmless." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression softened into recognition. "You see me," he said, as though startled by the realization, "and I find that disquieting." "So do I," Eleanor answered. They spoke then of smaller truths, of loneliness borne differently, of expectations imposed without mercy, of regret that lingered like old wounds. They did not speak of love. That word was too dangerous, too final. What passed between them was more perilous still, understanding. When at last they parted, the rain had eased, but the tension had not. Eleanor returned to the house with her pulse unsteady, her future more uncertain than ever. Behind her, the Duke remained where he stood, aware with chilling clarity that retreat, once possible, had slipped beyond reach. Society had not yet pronounced judgment, but it was watching, and neither of them could look away. The crisis, when it came, did not arrive as thunder. It came as paper, a letter, crisply folded and sealed, delivered at breakfast beneath the gaze of witnesses. Eleanor recognized her cousin's hand at once. Elegant, assured, merciless in its neatness. Arabella did not raise her voice. She did not accuse aloud. She merely smiled and waited as Eleanor read. The contents were devastating in their restraint. A suggestion of impropriety, a concern for propriety, a warning that continued residence at Ashbourne, given certain appearances, might compel decisive action. The word ruin was never written. It did not need to be. By noon, the drawing rooms hummed. By evening, the whispers had sharpened into certainty. A matron declined to sit beside Eleanor. An invitation, once extended, was quietly withdrawn. The air itself seemed to recoil from her presence. This, then, was how a woman was undone, not by proof but by permission. Eleanor bore it with a stillness that frightened even herself. She moved through the house as one already half vanished, her dignity a fragile, deliberate thing. Only once did her composure fracture, when she encountered the Duke in the long gallery and saw, in his eyes, that he had heard. He did not speak then. He merely inclined his head and continued on, his expression unreadable. That night, the ultimatum was delivered. Arabella sent for Eleanor privately, her tone almost kind. "You must see," she said, arranging her shawl with delicate precision, "that matters cannot continue as they are. His Grace's duty, to his title, his estate, requires clarity. Your presence complicates what ought to be simple." "And what would you have me do?" Eleanor asked. "Leave," Arabella replied softly. "At once, before matters become irreversible." Eleanor nodded. She had expected no other end. But the Duke of Ashbourne had reached his own. The declaration came not in secrecy, but in full daylight. At the following evening's gathering, a dinner attended by neighbors, relations, and those who would carry news far beyond Ashbourne's walls, he rose from his seat once the final course had been cleared. Conversation faltered. Glasses stilled. Attention turned, obedient and alert. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. "I find it necessary," he said evenly, "to address a matter of speculation that has, of late, engaged more interest than is warranted." A ripple passed through the room. "I will not pretend ignorance of what has been whispered," he continued, "nor will I permit conjecture to substitute for truth." He turned then, not dramatically, but decisively, and looked at Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor Harcourt remains at Ashbourne by my express wish," he said. "Not through charity, not through indulgence, but through respect." A silence, vast and terrible, claimed the room. "I have been advised," he went on, "that such regard is inconvenient. I reject the premise. I am answerable for my conduct, and I accept that answer fully." Someone inhaled sharply. A matron stiffened. Arabella's smile faltered at last. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Exposure burned through her, but she did not bow her head. When the Duke resumed his seat, the world did not end. It merely changed. Judgment followed swiftly, as it always did. Some guests departed early. Others remained, curiosity outweighing disapproval. By morning, Ashbourne was the subject of a dozen letters and twice as many interpretations. Yet amid the censure, something unexpected stirred. Admiration, quiet and reluctant, for a man who had spoken plainly where others hid behind decorum. For Eleanor, the reckoning was private. She was summoned to the library once more. No firelit confrontation this time, but morning lights spilling across the shelves. The Duke did not stand when she entered. He did not need to. "I have compromised you," he said without preamble. "You have acknowledged me," Eleanor replied, steady despite the tremor in her hands. He regarded her for a long moment. "I will not pretend that what follows will be easy. I offer no rescue, no absolution. Only this," he paused, "my life, if you will have it. Not as charity, not as atonement, but as equal." Silence pressed close around them. Eleanor's breath caught, not with hope, but with fear. "If I accept," she said quietly, "I lose what little protection remains to me. I will be judged. I will be blamed. I will be remembered." "Yes," he answered simply, "and I will be judged with you." She searched his face for hesitation and found none. When she spoke again, her voice was low but resolute. "Then I will not be hidden." Nor was she. Their marriage, when it came, was neither lavish nor subdued. It was correct. It was deliberate. It bore the unmistakable mark of choice. Some doors closed. Others, unexpectedly, opened. Eleanor stood beside the Duke of Ashbourne not as ornament, but as presence, her intelligence consulted, her dignity intact. In time, the glitter of chandeliers gave way to quieter evenings. Firelight, books shared, conversations unguarded. Love, when it settled between them, did so not with spectacle, but with certainty. And thus, in an age that punished women for boldness and men for conscience, love became something quietly revolutionary. Not permitted, chosen.